morning and welcome to Vital Conversations with the Mountain Sky Conference. My name is Michael Smith and I am the Superintendent of Congregational and Community Vitality. And with us this morning is Joe Primo joining us. Joe is the CEO of Good Grief, which is a leading voice of grief, mourning, and building resilience in children, families, and communities in the face of loss and adversity. Joe's an international speaker, author, commentator. He serves on the board of Option B at the Sheryl Sandberg and Dave Goldberg Family Foundation and Venly, an audio-focused spiritual health app. He's a national spokesperson for the Funeral Service Foundation's Youth and Funerals Initiative and is a past president of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. He has his Master's of Divinity degree from Yale, where he concentrated in end-of-life care. He later served as a hospice chaplain at both the Connecticut Hospice and the Hospice of Southeastern Connecticut. So, Joe, we are really excited to have you as part of our conversation now to share with us on this topic of grief. So we welcome you, and you've got quite the bio and background. And Joe, just tell us as we get started, just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump into our conversation. So just welcome.
Yeah, thanks. It's really good to be with you all. Probably like everybody else. Every day is a different day around here. Some days I am ready to rock and roll, and other days I'd like to stay in bed and avoid the news at all costs. But it's really interesting. I'm excited to have this conversation because I feel like we're in this moment of to an extent, a cultural awakening around what it's like for us all to be sharing in this both communal experience and this communal grief. And I think there's so much that we can take away from this shared experience. And of course, I work with grieving children and families. So I have a lot of perspective, I think, based on just listening and being a companion to these families that I hope will be some helpful tools and resources for you all who are listening and watching.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. You mentioned you work with grieving children and families every day. What can children teach us about grief?
Yeah, so if anybody is I don't know if it's cool to admit this anymore, but if anybody out there is a news junkie like I am, you probably heard a lot of commentators and maybe even seen op-eds of people talking about this experience as being a shared grief, that what you're feeling right now is grief. And when you think about the isolation, the fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty, maybe even some of the sprinkling of joy that comes up in all of this, reconnecting with relationships that you hadn't seen in a while. There are so many aspects of this moment that are parallel to what a grieving person, and particularly what a grieving kid feels. And when you think about when somebody dies now, outside of COVID, right? Just prior to this time, what do we tend to do? We tend to rush to the kitchen, make our lasagna, drop it off on people's porches, and 6 weeks from now, we expect people to sort of move on. And this sense of isolation and breakdown of communal bonds and even social interaction and connection that we're experiencing in COVID-19 looks so much like what a kid's grief experience is on a day-to-day basis. And I think maybe to contextualize some of this conversation and some of the hopefully nuggets that I get to leave with you all is to make a few important paradigm shifts here. Because when we look at grief more broadly, when we look at what a grieving child has to face on a day-to-day basis, that all happens within a context, right? This isn't happening within a vacuum. And the isolation that a child feels is because of how our culture responds to grief and loss and adversity. That the pathologies and challenges that a child faces, that is not inherent to grief. Grief is a normal part of the human condition. And yet there are all of these risk factors that exist. These risk factors exist because of how our culture responds to people when they're hurting. So I want to make a little bit of paradigm shift here in the sense that I think in a time of crisis like COVID-19, it would only be natural for us to look towards our elders, right? To look to people who have gone through adversity, and perhaps has some wisdom to share with us. But I'd actually like us to do a bit of reversal. I actually think that children have a great deal to teach us about how we can build resilience in this moment and ultimately be stronger when we come out of this. Because kids, they live in grieving kids in particular, live in a world, right, having lost, say, a parent or a sibling, in which, as a result of this experience, they realize that they can't be stuck in the past. And they can't really focus on the future because it's uncertain, and that they really have to lean into the present moment. And it's really important for me to emphasize, I don't mean that in the cliched way. I mean that quite literally. Being in the present moment is, it's a strength. I think it's an act of mindfulness. And I mean mindfulness even in the context for this group, as we would think about it in the terms of contemplative prayer and what being present in this moment means, and having that awareness and openness to what's coming at us. Because when we do that, that allows us to be more vulnerable. So another characteristic that grieving kids have that I think is really important for us is a willingness to be vulnerable and to be authentic. And I think even in this context, as we're all showing up for our Zoom calls, I'm actually really tickled by it, because it's amazing. Obviously, you all have to look at me for a while. So I was trying to be really fussy about, is the light okay? Can you see me? Like, what's the social etiquette? Am I supposed to wear a blazer? Am I supposed to wear a tie? I don't know. We're looking into each other's homes, and you're like, and now you can look at some of your colleagues and say, well, interesting. I see we haven't cleaned up in a little while, have we? Right? That's grief is just like, you show up as you are, right? There are no masks, there are no false pretenses. And I think what we're doing in this pandemic is we're showing up as who we are. Half the times, it's button-up shirts on top and pajamas on the bottom, and we're doing our best. And grieving kids know that, hey, those are parts of the rules of engagement here. Every day is a new day, and we're going to do our best in this moment, which is to also say that grieving kids don't live in a world filled with shoulds, should have, would have, right? They don't should all over themselves. They are authentic in the moment. And when we look at what a grieving kid needs in order to be vulnerable, and I'll unpack some of this more shortly, but what they need and how it's applicable to us, and I'm not trying to be political here, but you can read between the lines if you'd like to. Facts matter. What we need when we face adversity, and as we're trying to build resilience, and what grieving kids show us time and time again, that facts help us construct a narrative that prepare us on a day-to-day basis how to respond, how we should show up. And so for grieving kids, they need honesty. They need a safe environment so that they can be who they are and show up as they are in that present moment. And to stick along these lines of a paradigm shift, I think this is a really, really important one. So I started off by saying, hey, listen, there's a parallel between what we're experiencing in COVID-19, and there's a real parallel to what grieving kids are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Isolation, fear, anxiety, uncertainty. Those are really heavy feelings that are accompanied by heavy thoughts. That's grief. So if you look at some of the characteristics of grief, probably natural response to think that grief is this bad thing, that it's this icky thing, it's this hard and challenging experience that if we can, let's keep it over here. Like who wants to deal with those types of feelings? But here's the paradigm shift I want to make for you all. And I think this is really important to our thinking, especially as we move into some other subject matters, that grief is not bad, but grief is good. That grief serves a purpose And it has been a part of the human condition since the beginning of time, and it gives us the tools that we need in order to forge a new identity. So in the context of bereavement, grief allows us to forge a new identity as somebody who has lost someone we love. Right? It is what brings us to that new norm. In the context of COVID-19, this grief experience is leading us to our becoming. Who do we want to be as individuals and as a community, right? I think as a group of Christian leaders, we probably all have a lot of passion about issues pertaining to social justice and the poor and how we care for others and how we provide pastoral care, right? And in this moment, grief helps us rethink who we want to become on the other side of this. So yes, grief is hard, it's difficult, it is a forging, it is a churning process, it is an undoing, but it is also a becoming. So as laborious and as hard as it is, just because it's difficult doesn't make it bad. Grief is good and it serves a purpose. I see that day in and day out with kids. They show up 2 weeks after dad dropped dead of a heart attack. And then 2 years later or so, maybe they're leaving our programs, and I see a whole new person in front of me. And that child has become who they are because of what grief has done in their lives. So grief is not about overcoming, but rather engaging. And so I want to make one last point in this sort of conversation around how grieving children can be our teachers for grief broadly, and also within this context of COVID-19. And so in order to do that, I want to share the good grief philosophy with you. So this is sort of our model and mindset. And I think in addition to the grief is good mindset, these other 4 components hopefully will shape some of your thinking as we reframe this subject matter. So when we're interacting with children and family, here are the 4 things that we're always having in mind and trying to help them build their resilience and find their way forward. First, we need to embrace our grief. We need to engage it. We need to integrate it into our lives, and then we can begin reinvesting in the future. We can begin reinvesting in the future now that we know that those who are most important to us can die. So think about that through the lens of a 3-year-old, because we're doing this work with a 3-year-old, we're doing it with an 8-year-old, we're doing it with an 18-year-old, we're doing it with a surviving parent. So we need to embrace our grief. That means this is not something to be swept under the rug and to pretend like it can be contained to a particular moment in time, right? Our grief is not something that is a part of our past. So if we embrace it, then we can engage it. So what is this complicated thing that is transpiring in our life? What are these big thoughts and these scary feelings? What are these questions? What is this meaning making that we're doing as part of our grief experience? We're able to make meaning as a result of having engaged our grief and having embraced it. And when we do that, we're also better equipped to, and probably more comfortable to now begin integrating our grief into our day-to-day living, right? Because grief is not something that is linear. It is cyclical. It happens in waves. For kids, it happens throughout different developmental stages, right? And I think for all of us, depending on where we are in our life, we're going to experience our grief in different ways. And so it's an integration of grief, but it's also an integration of the person who died in that relationship into our future. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about how we can do funerals in the time of the pandemic. But ultimately, when somebody dies, they are not just a part of our past. They are a part of our past, our present, and our future. And when we integrate them into all aspects of our life, we are more resilient for it. And then ultimately, we can reinvest in our lives and in a future, despite the hardship and adversity that we've faced, whether that be through death or whether that be through an adversity like the pandemic.
Yeah, Joe, can you do a little bit more of a deeper dive on, obviously, in this COVID-19 time, what are some of these paradigm shifts that you've talked about, some of the philosophy that you talked about? How are they really specific now with COVID-19 and what it's teaching us about grief?
Yeah. Um, so first and foremost, I think we live in a time and in a world as modern people who like to think and believe that we can control our outcomes, that we are in charge of our lives, and we have far more control than we really do. But I think what grief shows us that in one moment, the most precious person in our life can be here this morning, and by this evening, they could be gone. It shows us that there's so much in life that we can't control. And as one teenager shared with me in the past, she said, all you adults are naive. You think you've got way more control than you actually do. And as a result, all you do is stress yourselves out. And I think that's true because I thought of her words in the context of my own life. Probably like many of you, you have to I have to fundraise, right? Whether you're keeping the lights on in your parish or your ministries. All of our programs are at Good Grief for free of charge. So I spend most of my time stressed out of my mind about where I'm going to find my next dollar in order to provide free programs to all these kids, right? And then I have a kid like Amanda who comes to me and says, "You're naive. There's good for you for putting in all that effort, and you should." But there's no point in fully stressing yourself out because you can't fully be in control of the outcome. I also really appreciate the fact that kids have this understanding that you don't have to take a deep dive. You don't have to take a deep dive into the pain, into your grief, or even into um, parts of your life where if you're not in that place on a given day, you don't have to go there. So the image that often comes to mind for me is, that kid, you leave them in the candy store, what are they inclined to do? They're inclined to binge on everything in front of them until they get a bellyache. They need somebody to say, whoa, half a bag of M&Ms is okay, 2 bags, you're going to regret this terribly. But I think outside of just consumption of delicious, yummy things like M&Ms and cake, which is my weak spot, kids have this innate ability to self-regulate how much information they also take in. So if you were, I'm not going to go down this road today, but if it was your job, because you're at a hospice or a hospital or one of your parishioners dies and you need to communicate this death to this person's children, you wouldn't fire hose them with tons and tons of information. And they also wouldn't ask for tons and tons of information. They're going to take one bite at a time, just to take a bit of information, absorb it, examine it, process it. Oh, got another question. And then they're going to ask a little more. So I think in times of uncertainty, in times of fear, in times where we just might be anxious and maybe even making ourselves and other people around us more anxious, I think what kids show us is we can pace ourselves. And in other ways, made a joke about reading too many newspapers. I think it's really important that we ourselves and for those we support remember to shut off the media, to pace ourselves and how much information we consume, and to have a sense of mindfulness around how is our body and our mind and our emotional state responding. The more articles we read, is that soothing, or do we find ourselves on the verge of a panic attack? Because if it's the latter, maybe it's time to close the computer screen. So with all difficult information, hard information, pacing is really, really important. I think a really, really critical piece of information to build off of these paradigm shifts is that resilience gets a lot of attraction these days. I think a lot of people talk about how do you become more resilient, and I still think it's a very, very, very important conversation for us to have as communities and as individuals. But I think resilience needs a little bit of PR help, because in our culture, I believe there's still a tendency to believe, I can see Steve on the screens I'm going to pick on. Steve comes bundled with either a full tank of resilience, a half a tank, a quarter tank, or he is crap out of resilience. I saw a thumbs up. I think Steve is out of resilience. Maybe this next part will help you, Steve. But we don't come bundled with X amount of resilience. I think we tend to see, kids are born, they bounce back really early on. And so we think, oh, we're just a really resilient species. Yeah, that's true in part. But resilience is actually a muscle, and it can be trained, right? We can't just all sit around and have a collective group think and say, you know what, we're going to put all of our time and energy to fantasize about the most rockin' beach body we're going to have this summer, or just will it to fruition, right? We're all walking out of this Zoom call with a six-pack because we want it. You have to take steps. You have to go to the gym. You have to work on it. You need a meal plan. You need to be consistent. And resilience is the same way. It's a muscle that can be trained, and it has attributes and characteristics. So the outcome of resilience is really a compilation of all these different characteristics. So, some examples are having a support system that's non-judgmental, having a support system who's going to show up for you when you're hurting, having somebody in your life, as anxious as they might be about their situation, they're able to put that over in the corner and be fully present to you and your needs. Having the vocabulary to be able to articulate one's fears, right? And I think there's some really amazing work. This community might know about it on nonviolent communication. It's pretty popular within, I think, the religious space. And this nonviolent communication is really an acknowledgement that we are so much more than sad, mad, bad, happy, joy, right? That we have needs, many needs that are foundational to the emotions that we experience. So the ability to say, hey, I'm not mad at Michael. I'm disappointed because I've texted him 3 times saying I'm really hurting and he's not getting back to me. It's not mad. I'm disappointed because I thought I could rely on him. So training our ability to articulate our feelings, training our ability to differentiate between healthy support systems and unhealthy support systems, having a mindfulness or a prayer practice. All of these things are characteristics that ultimately build our resilience and support our emotional and physical health. And then I think ultimately, this idea of resilience, I've already made this point, but I think it's an important one to reinforce. It is about identity. And for us in this moment of time with COVID-19, it is a question of who do we want to become after we're on the other side of this, this pandemic? Because are we a resilient community when we're leaving people of color behind? Are we a resilient community? I live in Philadelphia, and today, 5 weeks after us all being stuck at home, today is the first day the kids have gone back to school, right? So our systems are not functioning. They are not resilient. Is your family? Is your church community? Is your local community and government, and then the larger governments, are they resilient? We all have our different opinions about that, of course, but I think we need to be asking that question. And the only way we're going to be able to, I think, address some of those external problems is for us to think about some of how that applies to us internally. Because if we're not able to address that for ourselves, we're going to have a hard time providing feedback to other systems at B. I want to make one last point here, sort of this idea of contextualizing these paradigm shifts. And that is I want to make a significant reframe around thinking about grief. So not only is grief good, grief is not just an emotion. And some of what I'm about to say here might apply to you. If you think about what these past weeks have been like for you, you might be able to quickly relate to feeling alone and isolated and anxious and uncertain. But how often do you have a hard time getting out of bed? How often do you have a hard time concentrating? How often is your anxiety tied to questions of how and why is this crapshoot happening right now? Well, that's because grief is an emotional experience that has, as I already said, a variety of different emotions associated with it. And some of these emotions can contradict each other, right? That you can experience both joy and sorrow in the same breath, that these things can coincide. Yes, that's part of the emotional piece. But grief is also physical. And so what we see in kids are belly aches and headaches, inability to concentrate, what some people might call bad behavior, but what I would call an inability to self-regulate or self-manage behavior. So they're just expressing that angst, right, physically. For adults, it's the fatigue, inability to get out of bed, inability to concentrate, feeling like you're in a fog, or perhaps like every day is like every other day, that you're in a perpetual groundhog day. Some physical stuff. On an intellectual level, I mean, think about how often we say when somebody dies, I just can't wrap my head around the fact that that person is gone. It's because as part of this grief experience, we need to process and comprehend with our brain organ that this thing has happened. In the context of bereavement, that's understanding deadness. Somebody I loved was here this morning, and then tonight they're gone. It's going to take some time intellectually to experience that part of grief, the intellectual part. And spiritual. Grief is a spiritual experience. So whether this is for a religious population or for all of the nuns, doesn't matter. And not the nuns and habits. I would never bring up nuns and habits to a group of Methodists. But the N-O-N-E nuns, that at the end of the day, we are spiritual creatures. Whether or not you have a faith tradition is irrelevant, because spirituality is ultimately about meaning making. And grief, again, let's go back to one of my earlier points about forging a new identity and creating a new norm. That's meaning making. That is moving through and forward into your grief and into this new future. That's a spiritual process. So again, when we think about this, and I like to, and I'll say some more about this in a second, but let's be mindful that we're not just dealing with the emotional self, but the physical self, the intellectual self, and the spiritual self when we are supporting others, when we're dealing with it ourselves, for bereavement and all the manifestations of grief.
Good. Joe, let's take a quick pause there, because I know you've been going, so catch your breath, take a drink of water. And checking the chat box, one of the questions that's come in is, when we're talking about this big subject of grief, how do we just really define it simply? What would be your simple definition of this thing called grief? I know we've talked, I just put in the chat box, it's got not just emotional, physical, intellectual, spiritual, but as people are starting to navigate this, what's your simple definition of grief?
Yeah, it is a normal and natural response to loss. Loss has a sub bucket, right? That could be loss because of death, loss because of mobility, loss of job, loss of normalcy because you're in quarantine. It is a normal and natural response to loss.
Okay, cool, thank you. And before we move on, and we're going to talk about some more practical-ish, pastoral care items related to grief. What are some of any other questions from folks that are on this call that you want to send over to Joe? Well, any questions that are on top of your mind right now? See in the chat box, lots of times adults impose the should on kids. You should go back to school. You should go to the birthday party. You should be over it by now. A lot of grief work can be done to undo those should statements and begin from scratch and learning how to grieve in a healthy and safe way. Also, kids want to protect their parents from grief, thinking that they can't talk about the loved one who is gone because it makes mom cry. How do we talk to them about that? Thanks, Vicky, for sharing that in the chat box. Joe, you want to respond?
Yeah, Vicky, you're spot on. I think really important for us to remember that everybody's grief experience is unique to themselves. There is no one universal way to go about this, and I think as a result of that, that is what leads to all of this shoulding. People think that there must be a better way. This is such a hard experience. There's got to be a roadmap, some sort of pre-prescribed route that I can take. But it's so individualized that ultimately, I think if as a culture, as a community, if we can empower each other to develop more and better coping skills, that when we experience loss, that we actually have a bedrock. I think part of our problem nowadays is we don't have a bedrock as a launching pad. That our coping skills are not great as a culture, and so unless you're intentionally building them, chances are when that first trauma or tragedy or profound grief experience happens, you're sort of starting at ground zero. Vicky made another really important point. In that, I see this. So at Good Grief, we serve about 900 kids a month. And most families enroll in our programs between 2 weeks to 2 months after the death of a parent or sibling. And, in our first step with them is to have an orientation. And in the most functional family, right? These guys really had it together ahead of time. Now they had good communication. They spent family time together. They were by and large healthy, right? Even within that household, communication has completely eroded within 2 weeks to 2 months when they get to us. So essentially, when we're meeting a new family, the first time they're meeting with us is oftentimes the first time they have talked about the person who has died as a family since the funeral. Because when we're all, when we are all having a shared experience of pain and suffering, I think you can walk on eggshells, right? So Michael and I could lose the same person. Let's say we were brothers, right? But Michael's a sporty sort of guy, and I'm the guy who preferred, I don't know, to be outside gardening, and Dad was a sporty sort of guy. And so Michael and Dad had a great rapport and relationship. Dad loved me too, but our relationship was different. And because of the nature of our relationship, we are going to grieve that same dad differently. And that can cause serious tension. Or maybe I'm a teen and I have a proclivity to moodiness, and Dad was hard on me in the last couple of years of his life. And so I've got a lot of resentment towards him. I'm unhappy with him, but Michael is in team, he's on team Dad. And so now there's a tension between the two of us because our how we perceive the nature of our relationship is different. What's going on in the family unit is different for the two of us. So the key takeaway here is everybody is unique in their grief, and we can grieve the same person and have very, very different reactions. So that's going to impact the relationship of the living, how we interact, how we communicate. So I think it's a good example of the importance of what good pastoral care can do to facilitate those types of conversations and help the family system. I hope that was helpful, Vicki.
Thanks. I appreciate the questions that are coming in. I'm going to be monitoring them. I think some of what Joe's going to talk about next with pastoral care can address some of what you folks have been asking in the chat box. But, for those, right, some of us on this call are clergy, and, we're trying to give some pastoral care in this time. What's some of your input or advice for us on how to do pastoral care in this time?
Yeah, and thanks for saying that. I not knowing you all, I know we probably have different folks in the audience. I'm trying to speak as broadly as possible to meet as many needs as possible. First, I've already alluded to this. I think we need to collectively accept that historically we have failed when it comes to grief, when it comes to bereavement in particular. And that we have to be doing things differently. And where we can begin doing that differently is very much around pastoral care. So let me just say reinforce two more points that I haven't made yet that I think is important. And first and foremost, there's still a lot of bad information out there about grief. So a bunch of you probably have heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and for those of you who haven't, bravo, you have less to undo within yourselves. But in 1969, Kubler-Ross wrote a book on death and dying. Americans were not talking about death whatsoever. Essentially, that shift happened during the Civil War. We had tons of communal trauma. It was literally a bloody, horrible war. People were exposed to just so much violence that we went from a culture of Puritanism where talking about the art of dying was the main subject to we are not going to talk about this anymore. So from essentially the Civil War until a Swiss psychiatrist shows up in 1969 and says, y'all, you need to be talking about your mortality. You're all going to die and nobody's having this conversation. People latched onto her immediately. Unfortunately, she was getting started. And so she put out this idea of the 5 stages, which you may have heard of. People say the 5 stages of grief. They were actually the 5 stages of dying. And any of you who have ministered to the dying know that there is no such thing as one day going from acceptance to bargaining to denial to, boom, okay, I'm going to die. Yay, here we are. But that's just not how it works. But Kubler-Ross put out a framework that finally gave Americans a shared language to talk about this. Before she died, she tried to undo this because she realized that that was a problem. Here's why I spent a little bit of time talking about that. Because culturally, what she did in '69 is still with us. Pay attention. There was an article that went around 2 weeks ago, forwarded left and right by Harvard Business Review, that was titled "What You're Feeling Is Grief," and this guy offers up the 6th stage of grief, right? So there's still reinforcement of this bogus idea. Grief is not linear. It is cyclical. It's like a roller coaster ride. If we can understand that grief is all over the map, it cannot be contained, it cannot be controlled, that is a futile task, then how we approach that from the pastoral care perspective can be so much more responsive and also inclusive to the needs that are right in front of us. So appreciate the fact that you cannot fix this. There is no destination. There is only the present moment. If we could do that collectively, I think we begin changing the grief experience for all of us collectively overnight, because we are still in this mindset of how do we fix, how do we control, how do we make it better? Because when we accept that, we also have to accept the fact that, yeah, the lasagnas don't work. That this is not about a 6-week or 2-month experience, that grief is a lifelong experience and it becomes manageable and it evolves over time. So that means we have to have long-term support systems. There are no quick fixes. Again, that changes our mindset. I also think that just like resilience, empathy gets a lot of buzz, but I'm not sure we are all on the same page about what empathy actually is. Empathy is that desire to understand, right? It is very much about understanding. It's not just about feeling with somebody. It is taking the time and the effort to understand their perspective and to appreciate that their reality is their reality. And to understand their reality is an empathic response. So I don't think we go all the way when it comes to empathy, because I don't think we go all the way to fully understanding that other person's perspective. And I think in the time of COVID-19, it's also really important for us to be committed to self-care and to self-kindness. Um, listen, self-care is not just about taking a bath and getting your hands on a glass of Pinot Grigio. Those are definitely components of self-care, and I do not discourage them. But self-care is more than those quick little fixes. I think, especially if we're in a helper role, we need to pace ourselves, that we can't go from helping one person to the next. We have to pause and we have to sort out our own fear and our own anxiety. Because I think what's so different in this moment, we are all in it together. And I don't think it's fair for people to expect of us that we're going to have our stuff together and we're going to be even keeled at all times, right? And be able to show up and to be empathic and to work to understanding when we are in the throes of the same sort of meaning making and questioning and potential fear as other people. So that means if we've signed up to be helpers, part of our commitment to other people then is to take care of ourselves. By making a commitment to our own self-care, that is actually how we are fulfilling our commitment to others. Problem is, and I'm as guilty as everybody else, people in helper roles tend to put themselves on the back burner. And so, as a pro tip, you might want to put some reminders on your calendar. So let's say you're going to visit with 3 people tomorrow. Spread it out. Put on your calendar your self-care time, which might just be sitting down and actually eating a balanced lunch, right? It might be meditation. It might be something else. Whatever it is that is fulfilling to you, doesn't matter what it is, but what matters is that you hit that pause. I think when we pace ourselves, that is how we are better present and most available and responsive to those who depend on us to fulfill our helper role.
Thank you. My mind is just being blown right now. I don't know if you can tell on my video screen, but my mind is just like.
It looks like light. It looks more like a halo coming down on you. You have something you need to tell us, Michael?
Yeah, that's just God's favor, I guess. No, but wow. One of the things I know was mentioned in the chat box is, and you've talked about, a little bit about closure is when we do pastoral care, or grieving, it's like our culture, our systems say you get 2 days to do it. Corey put in the chat box, how do we help people walk with people when it says, you get 2 days to grieve?
Yeah.
So really thinking about, we're in this really strange time of what is, in some ways, what we do as clergy within the memorial services, the funerals, we're missing some of this now in the way of some funerals aren't being held, or they're just being held differently. In terms of another practical advice, you talked about pastoral care. What do we do with funerals at this time, or moving beyond at this time? What can grief, and the role of the funeral teach us and help us at this time?
Yeah. So that folks know, as I'm worried I'll forget, if you go to Good Grief's website, which is good-grief.org/COVID, we have a whole bunch of resources up there for COVID, but also a whole section up there about funerals. So with their podcast series, there's a downloadable toolkit. So that, I think that will expand upon this conversation. But let's start by appreciating that there is no such thing as closure. Funerals are not about closure. Yet another important, critical ritual and part of what it means to be human, the ritualization, the mourning. Funerals got bad PR. Funerals are the commencement of life without the person we love, or without a member of our community. They are a commencement, they are not a closure. So we have it completely backwards. And so when we think about this time, well, we got to ask ourselves, what are the implications of not having funerals on grief? So grief and mourning go hand in hand. They're codependents. Grief being this internal, by and large, experience with the four components we've already mentioned, but mourning being the outward expression. So in other words, mourning is doing. I think an interesting insight that I had, Michael and I spoke, I think it was either the first or the second night of Seder when we first connected. And we were talking about funerals. He's asking me some questions. And what was so keenly aware to me, when you think about a Seder meal, what's going on there? The people are empowered to ritualize. There is no priest or clergy person. Maybe the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, depending on the family dynamic, is running the Seder, but the people are empowered to do the ritual. Whereas within the Christian tradition, the people look to the clergy person to be the leader and to move us through the ritual. I am not suggesting that we scrap that, right? I think there's so much to be said about the importance of a clergy person leading us through a funeral ritual. But here's my point. When it comes to funerals, we started handing them over after the Civil War. That is when the funeral profession was born. So we used to take care of our own dead. We had a close proximity to death, and then we outsourced it. We haven't had the language to effectively talk about and ultimately mourn in a very long time. So I think one of the gifts that we can give to people after COVID-19 is an empowerment to change how we think about funeral rituals and to help people realize that funerals are not one-time experiences, that the memorialization of somebody who dies, mourning, can be done throughout our life. Right? Our outward expression of having lost somebody we love can be done over and over and over again. You see this with the Mexican Day of the Dead. They have a cultural showing up that acknowledges ancestry. And yeah, it's done with pageantry and other things too. But what's actually happening is mourning. You see this in Europe with All Saints and All Souls. A couple of years ago, I had a sabbatical in Italy, and I went to my grandparents' Sicilian villages. And in the middle of the day, it is filled with a bunch of folks bringing flowers to loved ones' graves every single day. It's just a normal part of their mourning. So we're dealing with a practical issue here when it comes to funerals, and that is how do we what do we do with the bodies of our loved ones? And then how do we communally show up? Sure, But what about the bigger question? How do we memorialize people throughout our lives? At Good Grief, we teach kids ways to do that with simple tools, right? This is not rocket science. So kids create memory boxes and put trinkets and memorabilia of mom or dad in it. They create art that help them express themselves, right? Outward expression, mourning, and they put it in the memory box. Around the holidays, at Thanksgiving in particular, we give them porcelain plates and they decorate them and they set a seat at the table during Thanksgiving. They feel very comfortable lighting a candle and reading a poem or creating a playlist of songs that trigger memories for them, or a playlist of music that reminds them that their loved one used to listen to, right? Memory triggers. I think when we come out of COVID-19 and we spend our summer and falls presiding over or participating in funerals, probably then we will realize that what we're doing to the bereaved is unjust. There is no reason why people can't be empowered to memorialize and to express themselves and mourn at home and with their family, and to have to delay their grief. And there is this idea of delaying your grief is going to vary, right? It's going to depend on what somebody's needs are. But if we're mindful of the fact that grief and mourning are these codependents, then I think that helps us understand that when we're not empowering culturally and as a faith community people to find ways to mourn, they're not fully able to dive into their grief, right? They're grief is going to come as like a wave at them. There's much that they're not going to be able to control or regulate. But the lack of ritual, the lack of empowerment, the lack of saying, here are things you can do at home. You don't need me. You don't need a church in order to do some of your mourning, right? We should have churches for those, and we should have those rituals. Because I don't want to muddy the water here and pretend that or suggest that we should not be having funeral rituals. I preside over funeral rituals in churches. I fully believe that. But this idea of continued memorialization, that is where we have a significant gap. And I think that's where clergy people can do a much better job of helping parishioners reframe what they can do. And the truth of the matter is, the funeral profession is 5 steps ahead. Within the profession, there are businesses and training programs to turn funeral directors into celebrants. And that's fine and good for those folks who've been disaffected by the church, I suppose. But the ritual is changing. And I think when rituals are not meaningful or significant, that's when that happens. And the conversation, I think, around how do we empower people to mourn ultimately can be influenced by the people of faith and the folks who do it day in and day out. That answer felt unclear, Michael. I don't know, you having received it, if it felt as unclear as me saying it, but maybe something people ask questions.
I think it's an interesting tension that we're living in of what we've been trained, to do. And I think you've really opened up a much bigger conversation for us on what it's like, to walk with people, to provide those moments of, remembrance of, how do we step outside of really thinking that, like, okay, I've done this funeral now they're good. I'm, as a pastor, I'm on to the next person that needs pastoral care,
Yeah.
and the challenge of saying that, like, no, like, this is an ongoing process for people. And And so I think it's been really, really helpful. I think you've stretched my mind in a lot of ways. So one of the things I want to throw out for us too is for you to think about, what about like institutional grief? I remember going through seminary and we were trained on the five stages or 5 steps, right? And this is the first time today when you're like, unlearn that stuff. And I'm like, that's all I know about it, right? So, I think a lot of us are saying, well, my church, or my organization is in the midst of these steps or stages. What can you speak to about, sort of our institutional grief and what we can learn from that?
Yeah, it probably varies across institutions, right? So I think in a lot of ways, hopefully maybe this conversation. Oh, we have little friends joining us. I love it. The girls are there. I think the more we learn and can amplify our learnings, right, within the institution, that's what's important. So when we see a need, and if it's not being fully fulfilled, I think we need to really raise that flag. And and today, so in 1969, Kubler-Ross said that children are forgotten mourners. You may have heard that. And here we are in 2020, and that is still fully accurate statement that our culture does not empower children to do. So, give you an example. Let's go back to the funerals for a second. How many of you have met with a family, because let's say it's a grandparent loss or a parent loss, so their grandchildren or children involved, and how many of you have gotten down at a child's level, squatted, and had a conversation with them about what they would like to do during the funeral service? It doesn't happen often. And now, how many of you have visited a home, squatted yet again, and gotten down to that kid's level and asked them, what is this experience like for you? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? I think it starts as practitioners, because if we have those encounters and that experience, it gives us both the framework and the experience to sort of raise the flag and to have that conversation with institutions. Say, here's the experience I had, here's the outcome I was able to facilitate. And I know probably, across the Methodist Church and then your own conference, you probably have different identities, I would imagine, in the same way as an Episcopalian. I see all the different identities across dioceses, right? And that's just what it is. But where can you be empowered to learn and to begin making some of those systemic changes? I think that's the question for all of us.
Well, thank you, Joe. I really appreciate, you getting to just share and give us some good tools. I really want to open it up. I know it's at the hour mark. Joe, if you're willing to stay on maybe a few more minutes. Yeah. I know if people have to go, they have to go, but I wanted to just give some time for open Q&A for people. I know I've been trying to monitor the chat. There's a lot of great resources coming in. There's some questions that are coming in, but if you feel like your question hasn't been answered in what Joe shared already, and you want to go ahead and offer it up to the group, go ahead. This is the time for open question and answer and a little bit more discussion with Joe. Go ahead, folks.
This is Bill Gamble. I tried to write something in the chat, but I appreciate your comments about how to encourage young children to adjust to the new norm. I felt so unprepared when a few years ago, a young mom member of my church under 30 with 2 kids, 1 5, 1 3-year-old, asked me to talk to the kids about the loss of their dad. as you said, it was easier talking to the 5-year-old. He had more of a, I won't say concept, but at least he realized what was going on, but had a hard time adjusting to, quote, the new norm. And a 3-year-old, I'm not sure all she knew was daddy wasn't around. And my question was how do we get young kids like that, 3-year-olds, to quote, adjust to the new norm? How do they embrace grief, as we talked about earlier? And I guess it depends on the kid, but how do we encourage them to do that?
Yeah. No, Bill, that is a great question. And I really want to affirm that it's hard, right? Because I don't know of any divinity school or seminary that is teaching this critical content. Michael shared my background. So I was a hospice chaplain at 2 hospices, one of which was the Connecticut hospice, the first hospice in the US. And I had young patients dying, and it was my job to help the parents say goodbye to the kids and vice versa. I was walking those kids to the front door after the death. I was there at the moment of death. I went to my professors and I said, how do I provide good pastoral care? Crickets. And this is 2003 to 2006. So this reinforces my point about this is a systemic cultural problem. So what I don't want is for you all to feel bad and feel like, oh, I am inept, because we're all inept. That's the reason why I got involved in this work, because I figured I have to be a part of the solution in some way. So I think that's a really important thing to name, Bill, because I think probably everybody on this call is in a similar sort of boat. How did that?
Babies in my church.
Yeah. How do you get a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old to understand and to adjust to the fact that mom or dad or grandparent or even the next door neighbor who they spent Saturday afternoons having milk and cookies with, that person is gone? There's a lot to be said about that, and I'm happy to go down that road with you all. Perhaps the more helpful thing for me to do, though, is to direct you to Good Grief's website. Again, it's good-grief.org, because on there you're going to go to the resource page and you will see a bunch of tip sheets. They're all free, so you can download them, distribute to people. If you have a pastoral care committee at the church, use it however you want. You're welcome to it. But there, we have scripts up there that aren't meant to say this is exactly how you do it, but rather to provide you with a framework. Because at the end of the day, what's most important is that you find your own words, and that you are authentic and vulnerable in those interactions. But there are some boxes that you want to check off. So with this group, I will say probably the most controversial thing that I can say, which is if you're talking to a child about death and you start with Jesus, you're cheating. Because that is not where you begin. Because the holy man in the clouds is confusing for adults, never mind children. It's too abstract. So there is absolutely a place for the spiritual makeup of a tradition, of a household, of what you believe. That's just not what you do out of the gates. And I'll give you an example. So many years back, I had a dad call me and he said, my kids won't leave the house. My wife died yesterday. The kids are 7 and 9, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do either. So let's go back. Tell me what happened yesterday up until this moment. So the kids got in a fight with mom. Mom rushed the kids to school, dropped them off, was late for work, got T-boned, and was killed in an intersection. A couple hours later, state troopers go to dad's office, tell dad what happened. Obviously, he's distraught. He calls his parents. He calls his wife's parents. The family descends on his home. He calls the school, goes to the school to get the kids. He arrives at the school knowing that the words in his mouth will forever change his children. He pulls up to the front circle. The guidance counselor and the 2 kids are in in the circle waiting for him. And he just starts to cry. And the words that he can muster out is, the angels came for mommy and now she's in heaven with God. And he sobs and the kids sob because they recognize that something bad has happened. But then he puts them in the car and they go home. But when they get home, the whole family's there. And guess what? Through the eyes of a kid, we're having a party. And I'm getting attention and people are saying mommy's dead. I don't really know what that means yet. And so far, I am like, as a kid, I haven't been given the facts and information I need to have the intellectual experience of processing what it means for mom to be dead. So then the next day comes and dad wants to take the kids to the funeral home to begin to plan the services. The kids won't leave the house because they're terrified that a flock of wild angels are going to swoop down and take them away to God in heaven. Because kids are concrete thinkers, and we have to take the abstract ideas out of it. So death is a biological event. That's what you're going to see on our website. How do you talk to kids about this biological event? Because we have a heart that we can feel beating. We have lungs that we can hear breathe. These organs work together. When one doesn't function, that leads to death. We can compare what it means to be alive versus what it means to be dead. And there's no one quick answer. Kids need repetition, right? So these tip sheets that you're going to see on the website will help just plant some reminders for you and for the parents or caregivers when that kid who's 4 years old, participated in the funeral, has been told that mommy is dead, and then 2 weeks later says, hey, when are we going to see mommy again? Nothing wrong, perfectly fine response. Because of where that child is developmentally, they don't understand the finite nature of death yet, but they will. And in the same way, that 10-year-old whose grandpa was killed in a gun accident, hunting, let's say, is going to ask every single gory detail. Oh man, was like his his brains blown out? Do you think the deers came and ate him? You might, as an adult, be like, this kid is dark. Like, I think we've just found our next crazy kid. No, a 10-year-old wants to know gore and details. So on the website, the tip sheet will show you how this plays out in developmental stages, and hopefully empower you on how to show up to a kid, and also not to be fazed by what they might be throwing at you, which could also include indifference. That a kid can be told mommy is dead, and then 5 minutes later say, okay, well, I got plans, I got friends to go see, so that's still happening, right? It's a normal response. So Bill got the long-winded answer. You can all thank Bill for that.
That's great. And good resource on the website. I put it in the chat box. I see Deb raised her hand. Deb Wacker, do you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. I have an experience. And I did this personally in my life as my husband passed away at 35 with a 4-year-old at home, and very quickly learned that as she was processing, that process changed obviously with age. But one of the early things I did was she always asked if, dad was in heaven with the angels, and I would say, yes, he is. So it got around to where she wanted to communicate with him. So whenever she was having a time, which she did more often at first, and then it balanced out a little bit, and we just went through her years. She's 24 now, but we would pull the car over or stop or run outside in the middle of the night, and we'd scream at the sky and talk to dad. And I would catch her out there talking to dad or crying to dad, or at different times in her life. But I've been using that concept in my ministry, and have found 3-year-olds who will walk outside and just be there. They won't say, they won't scream, they won't do anything, but they'll be there. And then I've had grandpas admit to me, yep, I had to pull an outsider, Deb, and scream at the sky. It got that bad that day. And so people have used that as a very simple way to just release the pressure. And so it's something I've used as an immediate, and as they are working through things, and I've had a lot of good response with it.
And what I like about that, Deb, is you've empowered the child, right? You empowered the child to say, I need to pull over now and I need to shout.
Yep.
I need to mourn. That's what that is, right? Mourn is a loaded word, but it's, I need to express.
Yeah.
And you gave a tool, and there are many, many ways to do that. And shouting at the sky is one. If anybody's looking for a visual and looking for a feel-good movie, I recently discovered on Amazon Prime, Troop Zero. It's a funny troop with, like, the black sheep kids who weren't fitting in with all the other cool Girl Scouts. And one of these kids, her mom died, and I think they did a good job of portraying a child's grief. And to Deb's story, this kid loved science and astrology, and so astronomy rather. And so she was, on a picnic table shouting out to the sky. And it's just a great example of how to normalize that is to empower.
Yep.
Thanks, Joe. As we wrap up, Joe, where can we continue? I know you mentioned your website. Any other ways that we can get more resources on this?
Depending on where you all are located. So if you have a family who is grieving, if you go to childrengrieve.org, the National Alliance for Grieving Children does list where there are programs like Good Grief in other communities. So that could be a good referral source for you, and see if there's anything in your neck of the woods, depending on where you live and who you're serving.
Cool. And I know you're on the Venly app, and you do some perspectives and some teachings on there. So I'm going to put in the chat box too, that if you want to continue to listen to Joe on that app, on that digital app, Venly gave me a promo code that you can listen for a month free. So I'm going to put that in the chat box, and you can use that link to download the app and just search for Joe Primo and listen to some more. I know he has a lot of content up on that app on Good Grief and some of the things with COVID-19. So just another resource for you. So Joe, you want to give us any final words?
Be patient with yourself, be kind with yourself. Grief is hard, but it's also good. And I think the more that make ourselves comfortable with the uncomfortable, the more we grow in this question of who do we want to become after this pandemic is over. Hopefully we begin to answer that for ourselves and for each other. And so grateful for your ministries, for who you are, and just the fact that you showed up for this conversation. I'm really grateful for that. So I hope you got at least one good nugget.
Great. Thank you so much. And we'll be back on Vital Conversations next week, friends, same time. Look for our links and resources. Joe, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk some more, and looking forward to connecting more on good-grief.org and getting some more resources. Have a great day, friends. Grace and peace to you.
Thank you.
Take care.